Hello and welcome to another episode of the DigiTeacher Digest. Last week I looked at De Bono's thinking hats, and this time I'd like to look at David Heyerle's thinking maps. So the thinking maps are a set of 8 graphic organizers, if you will, which are designed to facilitate different modes of thinking. So they are cognitive tools designed for particular types of thinking. So the circle map, for example, is designed for defining in context. The tree map for classifying and grouping, the bubble map for describing, the double bubble map for comparing and contrasting, the flow map for sequencing and ordering, the multi-flow map for cause and effect, the brace map for whole part analysis, and the bridge map for analogies. So each particular map has its own use. If you're doing a particular type of thinking, then this map should be useful, whether it's in an English class or a science class or whatever. So I'd like to break down some of these and how I've used them in the classroom. One of the things that you need to bear in mind from the get-go is that you need to kind of use these maps quite accurately. So you can't take, for example, a circle map and try and use it for a purpose that it's not intended. I mean, you can, but then you're not using the thinking maps anymore. These maps are designed for specific types of thinking, to afford that type of thinking. They're not designed, for example, for brainstorming or anything like that. So there is a wealth of different types of graphic organizers out there. These are designed for very specific purposes. And if you go to thinkingmaps.org, then you can learn more about how these maps are used. But I'd like to look at how I used some of them. I haven't used all of them because they were not really appropriate for the subjects I was teaching at the time. But I have used them extensively, especially in teaching English. So here are a few examples. I find the bridge map very useful for breaking down metaphors, because when two things are compared, you're comparing this to that in a poem. Normally there's a metaphor involved, but if you break it down, in what ways are those metaphors similar? So here's an example from Emily Dickinson's I Dwell in Possibility. So she writes, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. Of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. So you can see quite clearly early on, she says she dwells in possibility, a fairer house than prose. So because the house is fairer than prose, what is fairer than prose must be poetry. So she's saying that house she dwells in is poetry. In other words, poetry is like the house that she dwells in. And then the rest of the poem breaks down that comparison, that metaphor of a house for representing poetry. And a bridge map is quite good for breaking that down for a class, because you can draw it on the board, and when you break down what the base metaphor is, that comparison between house and poetry, then you can look at different aspects of the house that are described in the poem and what that kind of means, or what impact that has, what significance that has for poetry. So, for example, windows, well, you see out of a window. So it's something about giving you more vision, perhaps, than prose. Doors, something that you open to walk through. So that's something about opportunity. And when she talks about she dwells in possibility, it's the possibilities of poetry that open up, like doors opening up for someone. The rooms are described as cedars. So she's talking about forest, nature. Well, the rooms might be the topics that can be covered in poetry. Traditionally, nature is a very common theme, especially with Dickinson. The roof is the sky. Visitors are her readers, obviously, and the writer is able to explore a wealth of topics, opening up her narrow hands. So it's very useful if you construct that on the board and you walk through the poem with the class. And whenever breaking down the metaphor, when you look at each comparison, you write it down on the board. That becomes what you can then use to discuss the overall significance and meaning of the poem. So I think the bridge map is a very powerful tool for analyzing metaphor in poetry. Very, very useful. What other tools have I used? Well, you do a lot of comparing and contrasting just in literature, if you're looking at different characters, for example. So here's a task I did with grade 8 studying The Merchant of Venice. So I wanted to get the grade 8s to become accustomed to writing more extensively about literature. We were studying The Merchant of Venice, and I set them a mini essay project, and there were 3 topics. And they had to select one of the thinking maps. So they've been doing thinking maps. They knew how to use all of them. And I wanted to start getting them used to choosing which one to use. So up until that time, it had been fairly scaffolded. You will use this map at this time. But I wanted them to select the most appropriate map. So if you look at the first topic, obviously the keywords there are compare and contrast. So they're going to compare and contrast Antonio and Portia. And if you look at the thinking maps available, obviously that's the double bubble map. So the way that would be used, I can demonstrate in another map I have here. And unfortunately, I don't have any of the maps that were created for this Merchant of Venice essay. They were done using the Thinking Maps software, which we downloaded and had for a time. But that is no longer active. I have the files, but I can't read them because we don't have the software any longer. But here's another example in which a student was comparing Desmond Tutu and a Marching for Our Lives activist. I'm not entirely sure what the task was anymore, I'm afraid. I think it was in our thinking skills lessons. But in this document, you can quite clearly see what the student was doing. So in the double bubble map, in the 2 bubbles, you put the 2 things that you are comparing, in this case Desmond Tutu and Marching for Our Lives activist. And then between them, you put all the things that are similar. And on the outside, you put all the things that are different. And that gives you a solid base, for example, for writing an essay. So in our example, the students would have put down Antonio on one side, Portia on the other, looked at their similarities, their love for Bassanio, for example, and then all their differences. For example, Antonio is a man and has created his own wealth, whereas Portia is a woman. She cannot earn her own wealth. It is inherited. And these provide excellent discussion points for an essay. So here's one of the essays that resulted from this. And you can see that it has rather focused the writing. In my experience, the writing would have been far less focused on comparison and contrasting if they hadn't gone through the exercise of the double bubble map. So throughout the essay, she's quite clearly focused on comparing what is similar and what is not. For example, that both characters are quite depressed and both are rich, but one is older and the other is younger, and so on. So I think that the double bubble map, I mean, this is just a gut feel, but I feel the use of the thinking maps really helped focus in on creating a much more coherent piece of writing than might otherwise be the case. And I was very pleased with the results. But even though I found a great deal of use for different thinking maps when teaching English, when teaching computer science, I haven't found use for such maps. So if you think about, well, wouldn't the flow map be very good, for looking at algorithms? Yeah, but in computer science we already have a graphic organizer, and it's the flow chart, and it's a much better representation, within that particular subject. So which maps you use, I think, is highly dependent on which subject you're teaching, which ones you find useful. And just like the thinking hats that we looked at last week, you don't necessarily want to use them all. You want to find a tool that really works for you and use that one. So I quite often use the bubble map for generating ideas for writing a poem. In the center, you put what you're going to write about, and then around the periphery, you put adjectives describing that thing. And that gives you a basis for your poem. Works well. Or I've used a flow map to get students to break down the sequence in any narrative. So what happens first, what happens next, what happens after that, and so on, so that they can get an understanding of how the narrative works, to identify when the climax is, things like that. And circle maps are very good for taking the main idea of a piece of writing and teasing out examples, ideas, anecdotes, or definitions of what you're talking about. And using this for the basis of writing an essay, for example. So I've used thinking maps pretty much exclusively when teaching English, but if you think about the different types of maths, many of them are more suited to other subjects and would do very well for those. I hope that this introduction to thinking maps, if you haven't come across them before, has been useful, and that you will go on to explore this topic and find out how you can use the maps for yourself. I hope you found this very useful. And if you have, please like, share, subscribe, leave your comments in the comments section, and above all, hit that notification bell so that you never miss another episode again.